Okay. Hello, everybody. Uh, I don't know how warm it is where you are, but it's about 0 degrees outside here. We're going through quite a spell. Um, what we're going to do tonight is talk about. There's 3 levels I'm doing this. You know, the third, fourth, and fifth classes of this series are really geared towards techniques, practical sort of understanding of meditation and transformation. And in the last class, we wrap things up. And tonight is one aspect of that overall practical process where I talk about levels of meditation and levels of your own nature and how we're affected by these techniques. Before we do that, I want to pick up on a couple of things from last time that I forgot to mention, one of which was actually from the first class, I forgot to mention this, which was one of the more mind-bending things that I heard from Shelley Trimmer when I was studying with him. Might not be mind-bending to other people, but it was to me, was when he was talking about, someone was asking him about reincarnation, and he was making the comment that if you want to, you can reincarnate back in time, like in the time of Cleopatra. And that really did a number on my head because I even though I know that time is all that simultaneous and all that mystical stuff, I still thought that history was linear and went forward, and that you can't really incarnate backwards or forwards so much as just in a sequence. But he seemed to imply otherwise. And even though I had read that when I was 22 years old in Seth Speaks and various books like that, it still is something I'm wrapping my mind around because, in a way, the way Shelley spoke about the quote-unquote cosmic dream of God, Shelley and Yogananda, it's almost, we're in God's soul, so to speak. In fact, you could almost say, you hear this talk in the esoteric literature about the Akashic Records, you could almost say that we're in the Akashic Records, that this is taking place in the basement of the Akashic Records, you might say. And that it's like going into the British Public Library, and you've got the history section, you've got books, and you can take out one on Egypt one day, or you could take out one on modern day France the next day, and maybe a science fiction book the next, or in the reverse order perhaps. And it raises a lot of interesting philosophical questions, even some ethical ones, but it's an interesting idea just to contemplate this idea that time is not the way we think of it, which is what everybody says when they have these near-death experiences like Roger Ebert, and they come back and they talk about over there's no time. There's time in a way, but it's not the way we think of time. It's more like dream time almost, you might say. And another point that I wanted to make, I came up with another analogy for describing Kundalini I mentioned it last week, and I came up with another analogy for describing it that I think maybe is a little more effective than the metaphor I used last week, which is, again, think of that idea of the building, the structure that is the entirety of the cosmos. And the penthouse is what the mystic goes for through the elevator shaft, and the occultist wants to know more about what's on the different levels of the building, what's in all the rooms, the wiring, the plumbing, etc. But the Kundalini, the experience I had, the minor Kundalini experience I had at the Zen monastery, was somewhat like, imagine if instead of all these different people on the different floors of the building getting into the elevator shaft, like I said last week, suggested last week as a metaphor, imagine that every one of those floors, it's a 7-floor building with the penthouse at the top of it, and every floor is filled with helium balloons. But the doors to the central elevator shaft are closed, and suddenly from the bottom they start opening up, and the helium balloons kind of pile into the elevator shaft and go up to the top, as opposed to the classic metaphor of a serpent coiled up in the base of the spine, which I don't agree with. It doesn't describe my experience at all. Because it was the reason I use the helium balloons as a metaphor is it really was as though the energy was wanting to return to where it properly belonged, which is up here. It's not that it was somehow down there. In a way, it was kept down in the same way that you put down a beach ball underwater, but that its natural home is up here, and it was helium balloons, that idea of this uprushing sort of feeling, and no sense of craziness or power associated with it, Like when you read some of these accounts of Kundalini, that's not Kundalini that people are experiencing. It's really the Shakti when the energy veers off to the right or left-hand side. Now, what I want to talk about tonight, the gist of what I want to get to here has to do with what is enlightenment. You hear all these different terms in the tradition of, there's Kaivalya, there's cosmic consciousness, there's Christ consciousness, there's Samadhi, there's Santosha. Now Santosha isn't one, but there's a lot of different terms in the different traditions for this cosmic state, or maybe that's the wrong word, this enlightened state. And one of the most common that gets bandied about is Samadhi. And what I want to do here is go into Samadhi. I had an experience at the Zen monastery that is nothing particularly spectacular, though for me it was important. And it gave me some sense of what this is about, what Samadhi is about. And I think I can convey it, at least metaphorically, in terms of, a somewhat clearer understanding of it. And one of the ways I heard it described in the books was effortless concentration. I remember back in college, if I can backtrack just a little bit, there was a film, when I was at the Art Institute, there was a film by an experimental filmmaker named Jordan Belson, and he did a movie called Samadhi. And I remember at the time thinking this was some extremely elevated state. It was the same to me as enlightenment. Well, it really isn't. And it's a state of heightened concentration, but effortless concentration. As we're going to get to in a little bit, there's levels of Samadhi. And the way Shelley talked about it was our minds are going off in so many directions. We have 100, 200, I think it's more like 1,000 thoughts in any given moment. And Samadhi is limiting those, taking those thoughts down bit by bit by bit until you've got 10 thoughts, then 5, then 3, then 2, then finally 1. That's Samadhi. And the way that I can visually show this, if we can go to the pad here, Jim, is take a flashlight up against a flat surface. 1 second here. There we go. And the light is very diffused when I hold the flashlight away at a distance. And then as we move it in closer and closer, it not only gets more circumscribed, it gets much brighter and brighter and brighter until finally, you've got that, focused beam of light. And the way that we can go back to the big image here. Think of it as a laser beam is very similar to Samadhi in terms of its coherent light. It's where the light has been taken from a scattered state into a very focused state. And there's actually quite a few parallels between heightened consciousness and light. As scientists will tell you, at the speed of light there is no time. If you're going at the speed of light, you're in a timeless state. And that's very similar to Samadhi, where Shelley talked about once. He said, if you're sitting on the porch and you're watching someone jump rope and you go into Samadhi, a certain level of Samadhi, you'll see the girls stop in midair and just like hang in midair there until you come out of Samadhi. And actually, I did have a minor experience of that once driving cross country in college with my friend Bill. It was a top-down convertible. And I was dozing off, and the sound of the wind moving past the car, at one point, I was kind of moving into like a reverie, and at one point the sound stopped. It like froze, and I didn't think sound could freeze. Like if you try to stop a record or a tape, it doesn't just sustain like stopping a film. It leaves an image. And then I jolted out of it because it was such a shock to have that. It was like this freezing of time. That was before I heard Shelley's analogy. And in a way that what it's really saying is that by focusing on one thing like that, what you're really focusing on is the now, is the present moment. It's becoming so extremely zeroed in on the present moment, whereas we normally are so caught up in the past or the future. There's that John Lennon line, life is what happens to us while we're busy making other plans. And so it's this heightened focus on each passing moment and not being caught up in the past, leave no traces, they say at the Zen monastery, and not being, caught up in expectations. And the closest I had to a real experience of samadhi, albeit a very small one, a low-level one, was at the monastery. It was a few days after I had arrived, and we were involved in an all-day sitting, and my body hadn't yet gotten acclimated to that sort of regimen, that sort of discipline. And even though they break it up every 35 minutes with a 5-minute walk they call kinhin, I decided I was going to sit full lotus, which was a big mistake. I can sit full lotus for maybe 20 minutes without any problem, but not 40 minutes, and this was a 40-minute sitting. So I'm sitting there, and the pain starts to creep in my legs, and I didn't want to, I don't want to sidetrack there. I had a very embarrassing experience at the monastery involving legs falling asleep. This wasn't that, but this is where the pain got to be so severe that I'm thinking, I've got to do something to deal with this, because the tingling, it was like electric shocks going through my legs. And you don't move at the Zen monastery. You don't scratch. You don't move your position. You stay put, or else you catch hell from the monitor at the end of the hall. They scream out at you, sit still. So they mean business. And they're nice people, but that's the tradition. They're tough. So I'm sitting there, and the technique I was doing, I started from scratch with their techniques, and this was a very rudimentary technique of counting the breaths. And I'm counting each exhale, and I'm saying, I got to go into this all the way. It's the only way I'm going to be able to deal with this pain. And you're sitting there with your eyes open, because in that tradition, in that particular tradition, you're sitting there looking at the floor. In some Buddhist traditions, you look at the wall. But this was like a training wheels technique. But I went into it all the way, and I just kept going I was actually, as I'm looking at the floor, I actually went one step further, which they don't really recommend. I was picturing the numbers on the floor, 1, 2, and at some point something clicked, and I was so totally into the floor, into the experience of the counting, into the breathing, the whole package, that I don't know how else to describe it except to say I went supernova. There was a feeling as though I burst into light. And the pain completely disappeared in just a split second. There was just no residual discomfort. In fact, I was suddenly in the most blissful state I was ever in my entire life. It felt like literally waves of bliss coming off of me. And yet I could still think, I could still see what was going on, which I'm going to get back to in a few moments here, in terms of it was not a high level of samadhi. But it was like the entry-level samadhi. And it's just an ecstatic sort of feeling of being totally present. And at that moment, I says, oh, that's what it's about. It's just about being totally in the moment. So I suddenly had the key, and at least I thought I did, in terms of getting through my foot in the door, so to speak. And it was around that time, it only lasted about 10 minutes in the sitting itself, because the sitting was over in 10 minutes, and we got up and walked around, and for about 2 weeks, I felt, especially the next few days, but for the next few weeks, I actually felt that high from the experience. And I tried in the year or two after that to come up with metaphors to understand that experience and to communicate it. And one of the things that became clear to me was, I remember reading in the Smithsonian magazine years ago about people that fell from great heights off of buildings or off of mountains when they were climbing, but lived to talk about it. And they're describing what happened. And the curious thing about this article was, I believe that was the magazine, it said that all these people that had these seemingly horrifying spills off of mountains or buildings, none of them experienced fear or pain once they started falling. They went into this zone of being totally in the moment, and everything, in a lot of the cases, going into slow motion. That's very common. Whereas the people that were with them that watched it were traumatized, which I think is really interesting. When you're outside the experience, it takes on a whole different dimension than when you're in the experience. And I thought, that is really interesting, because when you're faced with imminent death, or what you think is imminent death, there's no more fooling around. There's no more thinking about the past or the future. You have to be in the moment as you see that pavement coming up or whatever it is. And I think that's part of the reason that people get involved. I think I have a picture here just to illustrate the point. Well, that's the joining of the sun and the moon, getting present with the moment of the. We'll get back to this point next week. Did I not have a picture of a skydiver in here? Oh, I see. All right. Yeah. It's after this. We'll get back to this. I had a real sense that people get involved in daredevil sports because they want to experience that high. Some of it's, I think, an adrenaline rush, but I think part of it is that sense of being alive, of being so, putting your life on the edge where you like the mountain climber or the skydiver or whatever it is, it puts you in the moment, although is it really a necessary length to which you have to go to experience that? Because the point I made in a previous lecture was how a person in the Zen tradition should be able to get as focused in the moment pouring tea as if they're jumping out of a plane. You don't have to risk your life to experience life. But a metaphor that came to mind for me, I was reading about atomic fission and all this, and I came across this idea of critical mass, which is where, I'll go back here a little bit to these previous images. Let's take critical mass as it manifests in outer space with the birth of stars, where you have this gas spread out that's diffused, that's not really focused, which is similar to our state of mind, you might say. And then gravity slowly draws in those clouds of dust until finally they move in so tight that it starts to develop atomic reaction. The heating becomes so intense under the force of gravitation that the latent energy that is frozen within that matter bursts open and light happens. That really explains very much what I felt in that minor samadhi state, where I focused my energy so much onto one thing, which was that meditation technique, that the light broke through. And I went afterwards to the teacher. You're supposed to go and interview with the teacher after any session. And I was explaining to him the experience, and I described it as waves of bliss, and he thought that was very corny, waves of bliss. He thought that was very new agey. But he validated that it was a real experience, but he said it was a relatively minor state of samadhi. And what I realized when I started reading some more about it, I went back to the yogic literature that Kriyananda and Shelley had taught me, and I saw that they had all these different names for different levels of samadhi. They had savikalpa, asamprajnata samadhi, nirvikalpa samadhi, sahaj samadhi. And savikalpa is where you still have thoughts going, sensory impressions. That's I think, what I had. Then the next level up is asamprajnata samadhi, which is where there's no more gross perceptions. There's no more obvious sorts of physical impressions or thoughts. The next level, nirvikalpa, nir like in nirvana means no. And I think that's what the Zen practitioners would call mind and body dropped, where it's like a pure consciousness. But then there's a level beyond that, which is sahaj samadhi, which is more integrated, and maybe we'll get to that a little bit later. But you hear stories like this in the sports field all the time when they talk about in the zone. There was a book written by Michael Murphy that I read when I was working here. They came in for review. It was called In the Zone, and it was basically a book about sports samadhi experiences, you might say, where a person is going out to catch a football. Excuse me. He's on the playing field, and he goes out to catch a football and sees it coming in slow motion to him. The time is slowing down. That's where you're so focused. People in sports often have these kind of mini samadhi experiences. And there's a story that I want to read here very quickly this is Colin Wilson, who died not too long ago. He talks here about, he didn't use the word samadhi, but this is what he's talking about, I think, savikalpa samadhi. On New Year's Day, 1979, I was trapped by snow in a remote Devon farmhouse, where I had gone to lecture to extramural students. After 24 hours, we decided we had to make an effort to escape. It so happened that my car was the only one that would climb the slope out of the farmyard. After several hours' hard work with shovels, we finally reached the main road. The snow on the narrow country road had been churned up by traffic, but was still treacherous. And in places where the snow was still untouched, it was hard to see where the road ended and the ditch began. So as I began to make my way home, I was forced to drive with total obsessive attention. Finally, back on the main Exeter road where I was able to relax, I noticed that everything I looked at seemed curiously real and interesting. The hours of concentrated attention had somehow fixed my consciousness in a higher state of alertness. There was also an immense feeling of optimism, a conviction that most of our problems are due to vagueness, slackness, inattention, and that they are all perfectly easy to overcome with determined effort. This state lasted throughout the rest of the drive home. Even now, merely thinking about the experience is enough to bring back the insight and renew the certainty. So that's a kind of a samadhi, and it's a state of focused awareness. But now this is where we have to switch gears a little bit, because this is not the be-all and end-all. And this is a point that I remember years ago Kriya making a comment. He said samadhi is merely the vehicle to enlightenment. And then when I went to the Zen monastery, it was kind of interesting because my personal feeling was that Daido secretly looked down his nose a little bit at the yoga tradition, and Kriyananda secretly looked down his nose at the Zen tradition, because they would say little things out of the corner of their mouths like, and I think both traditions have their virtues, and they complement each other, but they are a little bit different, but they're also very similar in their understanding of samadhi, even though they don't realize it. So, whereas I had just heard Kriyananda make the comment that samadhi is the vehicle to enlightenment, I go to the monastery and I hear the Daido say, samadhi is the rocket ship to enlightenment. Same point. It is the tool that gets you there. It is not the end point. In fact, I remember years ago a Buddhist claiming, I haven't looked up the quote so I can't verify this is a Buddha comment. He said the Buddha felt that samadhi could be a trap. And I think that's partly because it is so blissful. It's such a state of heightened joy, of bliss, of happiness, that you can get stuck there. And it's not necessarily enlightenment. It's a state of heightened focused awareness, but it may or may not be attending a state of heightened realization. And I think that's important to understand. Now let's go on to the next illustration here. This is an old, from about 1496. It's an engraving from a book, I think called Practica Musica by Franciscus Gaffurius. And it encodes a number of different esoteric ideas, but it basically symbolizes a certain worldview, the chain of being, like we've talked about before. I'm going to use the arrow to try to make this a little bit clearer here. Okay. See, this is us, this is Earth down here. That's our existence, shall we say. These are the 9 muses. Actually, they're the bottom muse, Thalia, is there, and these are the muses. These are the planes of existence going up to God, which is here symbolized by Apollo in the Greco-Roman tradition. You have a deity called Serapis, which has a serpent at his feet. And there's also this notion of the 3-headed animal of Cerberus. Excuse me, I got to take a little drink of water here. And these are the planets here. And the point is, these are planes of being, shall we say. And this is a serpent that moves up through the middle. And at the bottom, you'll see it's got 3 heads. There is a wolf to the left, a lion in the middle, and then you've got a dog to the right. This is all very, very symbolic, very interesting. I learned this from Joseph Campbell years ago, and he went into this diagram quite a bit in a workshop. The wolf represents the past, the sense of the devouring past, of how the past eats away our memories, and it's a more negative connotation. The dog represents hope, this kind of mindless hope looking forward to the future. And the lion represents the present moment. It's the now. And what this diagram is saying, which is really very profound, is the notion that it is through the present moment that you have a conduit all the way up to the enlightened state, the God principle. And that by being in the now, by being in the present moment, that is your doorway to the infinite. You could say that samadhi is the pipeline to God, samadhi is the pipeline to the Buddha nature. And the present moment is the pipeline, it's the doorway. So the more you can be in the present moment, the more you can go past all these different elements here. In this diagram, I'm not really going into depth with it, I'm just giving you a cursory overview. Some other time we can go into it if you want. But this is the key point, and it's, again, the serpentine symbolism is fascinating in so many of these traditions, that the central channel is symbolized by a serpent, which is sushumna. When you're in the present moment, if you're truly in the present moment, you enter into sushumna, that balance point between the two worlds, the crack between worlds. And let's go on to the next image here. And this has very practical applications. It's about getting to that, the awakening to your higher self, to the God principle, whatever terms you want to use, but it's also about being alive in the moment in a way that takes this samadhi principle and takes it to every experience you have, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. So this old Zen story that Kriyananda turned me on to from Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, profound story in my opinion. A man traveling across a field encountered a tiger. He fled, the tiger after him. Coming to a precipice, he caught hold of the root of a wild vine and swung himself down over the edge. The tiger sniffed at him from above. Trembling, the man looked down to where far below another tiger was waiting to eat him. Only the vine sustained him. Two mice, one white and one black, little by little started to gnaw away the vine. The man saw a luscious strawberry near him. Grasping the vine with one hand, he plucked the strawberry with the other. How sweet it tasted. End of story. It's one of those Zen stories where the first time you encounter it, it's like, what? But, in light of what I'm saying, like, Meredith, what do you think this story is saying?
Oh, it's saying you don't know what's going to happen next, but you can enjoy the strawberry right now.
Yeah, it's about savoring the moment,
Yeah.
It's not about savoring fruit, obviously. It's about what more pressures could you have than facing imminent death, because this man has tigers behind him and a cliff down below him, and yet he's still able to be in the moment. And that's one of the great lessons of Zen, and I think it's like one of the great lessons of all the esoteric traditions to some extent. One other quick little point I want to mention about this diagram that I wanted to mention last time. A curious little metaphysical aside here. If this is the God point up here, Apollo, which is sometimes shown, different deities occupy the high point, obviously. It's often Jesus in the Christian mystical tradition. But an interesting thing is that reality precipitates down from the higher levels to the earth plane. And so it takes time for reality to come down. Shelley used to make this odd statement. He used to say all this, when I pressed him, I said, are we in the memory banks of God? He says, yes. He said, all this was an action in the mind of God at one point. And in the Hermetic tradition, for instance, they talk about out of the divine principle, there comes the divine mind, which you might say is kind of equivalent to the starry firmament there at the first level below. And out of the divine mind, or the nous, comes the levels of mental, emotional, or you might say higher astral, lower astral, etheric, down to the physical. But what that's saying, in a sense, is that, in a weird sort of way, that's saying that God is in the future. That the higher you go, the more into your future you're going, which is one of the reasons why in the old traditions, one of the ways you could tell if someone had a true mystical experience going to the higher levels. This is true in the old Hebrew system, as I recall. One of the ways you can tell is if a person's prophecies came true. Because if you prophesy something 10 years down the road and it comes to pass, that indicates that you really were up pretty high in terms of reality before it precipitated down to this level. So, it's a curious way of thinking about things. And dreams, part of the reason that dreams are prophetic, Shelley and Kriyananda claimed it was 2 days, 48 hours from the time you dreamt something to the time it happened, is because when you dream, you're leaving for a higher level, the next level up, you might say, in the building to the etheric level. And so if you can remember your dreams and look at the symbols, you'll see them tend to manifest in reality a day or two later. Sometimes more than that, depending on how high up you went. If there's symbolic ideas, you have a dream about a car crash, it doesn't mean you're going to necessarily have a car crash. It may be a conflict with somebody in an argument, for example. Any questions about any of this? Did I see the? Oh, you have a question there. Can anything in Prakriti lead to Purusha if we focus on it enough? Yeah, I personally believe so. And this whole Prakriti Purusha thing is a really interesting idea. In fact, we're going to get a little bit into that next week when we talk about what does duality really mean. It's not what you think it is. And that I once asked Kriyananda, I pressed him about, he was talking dualism, and I was questioning it at the time, and I said, is Prakriti alive? That's substance, the divine substance, versus Purusha, which is spirit. And he thought for a while, and he said, yes. No, excuse me, I back up. I said, is everything alive? And he said, yes. And I said, including Prakriti? And you could see it kind of his gears spinning. He thought a long time, and he said, yes. And he said, that's one of the paradoxes of the Prakriti Purusha dualism, because I see Prakriti as being like the soul part of existence, the memory track, the emotional, the etheric, astral dimensions of being that reflect the spiritual, in a way. But I think anything in a truly that's a little too abstract. Let me think. Even though there is a kind of a duality of the Prakriti Purusha, I believe, everything is still spirit. And so anything can become a conduit to that awakening. That's a simple way to address it. Okay. Now we got to switch gears one more time here. Let's go back to the pad here, Jim, because what I'm talking about here is really just a partial view, because when we talk about enlightenment, does that mean just getting to the penthouse, or does it really mean, in some sense, transforming all the levels of your being, a holistic view, in other words, that doesn't just want to get to the penthouse? Like in alchemy, there's esoteric alchemy and there's exoteric alchemy. Esoteric alchemy is transforming you. It's transforming you from base lead into gold. And there's many different ways that's understood. It could be the chakras, from the bottom chakra up to the top, lead to gold, Muladhara to Ajna. But it also relates, in a sense, to transforming the body and the different vehicles and the sheaths into their natural luminous essence. Exoteric alchemy is where it's projected out into the world, where you're actually trying to do something with materials. But the inner process, which you see more so in the Eastern traditions, because there is Eastern alchemy and Western alchemy, and one of the things that you see in the difference there is that Eastern alchemy is more concerned with, you are the philosopher's stone, in a sense. It is not something external to you. And I'm simplifying a pretty vast set of ideas there, so I hope I don't get in trouble with any scholars on alchemy, but that's, I think, an accurate generalization. So how do we approach transforming the entire being? Let's say that this is a drawing representing you. And up here is the penthouse, so to speak. It's the pure I am. It's the pure spirit principle. And in the drawing there, we have the snake. It's still up on the screen. There's that elevator shaft that goes up there. What about all these levels down here? There's the physical, there's the etheric, there's the lower astral, the higher astral, the mental. You can't ignore these. This is, you might say, the soul, or some might say the anima mundi. And by soul, I'm including matter, emotions, mind. And so samadhi really, in some of these esoteric traditions, they're really focusing on this up here. But in the more holistic traditions, the integral traditions, you're really trying to take the whole system into account. So that the getting to the penthouse, so to speak, through deep meditation, interning, through extremely rigid sadhana sometimes, disciplines, you're also trying to transform the lower vehicles. And there's many different discussions about the sheaths and the different names for the sheaths. This is the earthly term. I found this online. I think it's fairly accurate in terms of how they present it. Well, you can do this backwards. You can either have the spiritual be in the innermost or the spiritual be in the outermost. But the point is there are these sheaths, there are these levels of being. And so how do we go about transforming these different vehicles, the Annamaya Kosha, Pranamaya Kosha, Manomaya, or Vyanamaya, Anandamaya Kosha, the bliss sheath? And I'm going to give you an extremely simple sort of practical understanding of this that I think is the way to do it. This is a twofold process. The one is that heightened meditation of heightening your samadhi, deepening your samadhi by going deeper into the technique, deeper into the moment, but then also transforming all the layers of your nature. And so what we can do here is go over the different sheaths one by one, and I'm going to give you what I call additive and subtractive techniques that you can use for purifying the vehicles. And by subtractive, I mean like eliminating certain things. Additive, I mean adding certain things, obviously, to your life in order to purify that. And before we do that, though, you see, it's an interesting question that comes up about, is it about heightening the awareness of that spirit so that it spills back over the other vehicles, the physical, the emotional, the mental, etheric, etc., and transforms them? Or is it about purifying the vehicles so fully that it allows for that innate light to kind of shine through? And there's two ways of saying the same thing, in my opinion. But if we start with the physical, for example, and you see this in virtually every esoteric tradition, whether there is discipline involved, whether there's any kind of deeper probing happening. An eliminative sort of technique would be obviously detoxing the body. It's very important in the yoga tradition to eat the right kind of foods, avoiding obviously nowadays junk foods, GMO foods, preservatives, dead foods. Trying to eat live foods, also fasting to some extent. You got to be careful with fasting. I think it's safer to just cut back on the amount of foods rather than actually fasting. Not everybody is equipped to fast, especially if their thyroid is low. But doing yoga, doing the right kind of exercises are additive sorts of ways of enhancing the physical vehicle, as well as breathing, deeper breath, getting more prana, getting more oxygen into the system. And I also think, by the way, that getting fresh air is an important facet of this. So those are some, drinking lots of water, good water, water that's been filtered or water that has Avian that's fairly pure compared to some of the tap waters that people have out there. And I also think purifying the physical body involves, in a sense, coming into harmony with the natural nature, the natural world with nature. And by that I mean the world you see is an extension of your body. The way a porcupine sees the world, or a snake or a bird, is different from the way you see the world. So your body is, in a sense, a reflection of the world. So blessing the world, blessing nature, coming into some harmony with your environment, whether you live in a 10th floor tenement or living out in nature. Either way, that's an important part of purifying this lower level show, if we can put it that way. The next level up would be emotional, and some things that you could do that help purify that would be detoxing emotionally, cutting back on negative thoughts, cutting back on gossip, cutting back on negative friendships, that sort of thing. An extremely important part of purifying the emotional body is forgiveness. Not just forgiveness of others, past, present, or potentially future, but forgiving yourself. These are very powerful ways of cleansing the system. I remember years ago, this is a little tangential, but not really. Years ago, I don't think this is telling tales out of school because he was very open about this. My brother, when he got back from Vietnam, had an alcohol problem and wound up going into AA. And he wanted the whole family to take part in this because they see it as a system sort of thing. And he invited me to come down to, along with his 2 kids, to a place called the Meadows outside of Phoenix, which is a recovery center where you bring people together to try to get off of alcohol or drugs or whatever it is. And I thought, well, this really isn't for me, but I did it to support my brother. But it was really uncanny because it dealt with addictive patterns of all sorts, mental addictions, emotional addictions, physical addictions. And it was a week-long process where it was detox on virtually every level, and it also wound up involving a kind of a prayer sort of situation. And at the end of that week, it was absolutely uncanny how I felt as far as this purification. It felt like I had just unloaded, lifetimes of negativity because you were talking things out in a therapeutic way, you were doing forgiveness, you were eating fairly well under the circumstances, etc. And I was doing meditation on the side. And so at the end of that week, it really felt like this overall sort of transformation that took place, and I was on cloud 9 for weeks later. So I think that, and a big part of that, this is why I brought this up, is that the forgiveness aspect of that process was a really important part of that. And you'd feel as though these thought-form barnacles are just kind of loosened from your aura. And by the way, it's one of the things when I taught Hatha Yoga, one of the breathing techniques we did was Kapalabhati, which is rapid breathing, where you're like that. And I asked Kriyananda what was the point of this, and he said one of the things it does is it shakes your aura in and out very rapidly, so you shake off thought forms, which is interesting because when you sneeze, you feel as if you've just released barnacles from your aura. If you don't notice that, pay attention next time you have a good sneeze. It is like a shaking off of energy thought forms. Mentally, so how do we purify the mental body? Obviously through the eliminative approach. I think a really important key to that is watching your negative thoughts, obviously. Uprooting negative thought patterns, self-defeating thought patterns, things that we all have at some subliminal level, kind of self-sabotage patterns. Also, I think silence is very important as a process. Learning to shut off the mind. You have to couple it with, the positive side of this is reading inspirational sorts of things, affirmations, doing positive sorts of activities and visualizing things, turning off junk food TV shows, for example, turning off junk food radio broadcasts, silencing the mind, getting things more quiet, trying to get more peaceful inside. So these are all very important things with the mental side of this. But now on the spiritual level, aside from the meditation and trying to heighten the samadhi, expand the samadhi, I think that prayer, however you conceive of that, is a very important part of that process of expanding your awareness of the spiritual nature. Like I said, reading the inspirational literature, scriptures, that sort of thing. Getting out in nature. If it's your cup of tea, worshiping some deity, that could be Krishna, it could be Jesus, it could be Mary, Buddha, whoever it is. It's like tuning your mind to more positive sorts of symbols and feeling states. And when you've done all this, when you've covered all those bases in that, personal pyramid, shall we say, it really is this overall transformation that is, in a sense, the philosopher's stone. It's similar to that image I had the first night, or the second night, I think it was, where this Adam Kadmon in the Kabbalistic system, which is prototypical man or woman, but it's also, in a sense, the potential man or woman. It's the enlightened being. It's the fully whole individual that's awakened to their spiritual potential, to the five-pointed star that we talked about in the center of the third eye. And the 5 points of the star relate to those 5 levels, which are now balanced and they're harmonized: the physical, earth, water, air, fire, ether, the physical, the emotional, the lower astral, middle astral, mental. And so you bring all these things together and you wind up with this heightened sort of transformation. Transfiguration is a term you sometimes hear. And again, relating it back to that higher symbolism of the 5-pointed star, the pentagram. And this is a drawing that a painting I started off with by that Dutch artist Joffre, the same artist that did the one of the 5-pointed star. And this is a hermetic set of symbolism, absolutely fascinating like the other one. It has many, many levels to it that has to do with the levels of our nature. The woman at the bottom represents physical nature itself, herself, the physical world. But the figure represents the anthropos, the Adam Kadmon, you might say. And then there's a level beyond it. You'll see that figure here, which I'll point out with the arrow here. This is the anthropos. That's the archetypal, perfected individual. But then you've got this higher potential there, what is in the Hermetic system called the demiurge. It's like the God self. And it's got the 5-pointed star in the chest. You can't see it too well on this illustration here. And you notice that the arms of the anthropos, one is down pointing towards earth and the other is pointing up, meaning that it's between the world. It's not fully transcendent, nor should it be necessarily. It's like a middle point between the two. Whereas both arms are up on this figure, representing a fully transcendent, a fully transcendent being. And so, moving on to the next image here, you actually have in some of the traditions, both Christian and yogic and Buddhist, this idea of the full-blown transfiguration as far as not just awakening to your innate divine nature, but in some sense transforming the physical vehicle itself into light, translating your body into light, into the immortal body. Now, some people take this very literally and believe, for example, that Jesus, like you have all this controversy about the Shroud of Turin and how it looks as though something dissolved beneath the, excuse me 1 second. Oh, that's way over there. I'm not going to wait. Oh, here. 1 second, folks. Sorry about that. In the figure here, one of the explanations for the Shroud of Turin is that the figure, in essence, transformed into light, transformed into energy, and drifted through the cloth. Whether that's true or not, the idea is a very common one in the esoteric traditions, and you see it in the yogic tradition of Babaji. Babaji was considered to be a figure who never fully died physically, but actually just transmuted his body into light. By the way, there's a lot of traditions that talk about Babaji and a lot of different lineages in India and America. And I asked Shelley once, which of these groups is right? Because some of these people will point to their teacher and say, my teacher is Babaji and all this. And some people say, I was visited by Babaji in a vision. And Shelley would talk occasionally about his experiences with Babaji. And in the one case, he said he was taking a shower, of all things, and the Babaji entered through the top of his head. And the contrast between Babaji's energy field and his was so dramatic, he said, that it sobered him up real fast, so to speak. I don't mean sobered in an alcoholic sense. But he says, I thought I was pretty spiritual until I felt that contrast of that energy enter into me. And so he really heightened his meditation beyond that and went out teaching a lot more. Take that for what it's worth. But I said, how do you tell which of these Babajis is the real Babaji? He had a very interesting answer. He said, ask the people who have claimed to have met Babaji what his real name was and what his real ethnicity or nationality was. Because he's not Indian and his name wasn't Babaji. Now, again, take that for what it's worth. It's an interesting answer because he seemed to feel that if you had really met Babaji, you would know his real name and you would know what country he came from. And most of these people claim he's an Indian, and a Hindu guru that's up in a cave or something. But Shelley seemed to differ with that. By the way, a story that Kriyananda related once that to me is one of the more interesting stories about his encounters with Shelley was the time that Kriyananda had this meditation where he said he felt oceans upon oceans of bliss. He said there's no word to describe it. It was just beyond any way you could convey it to anyone. And he was so startled by this experience, in a good way, but it was so cosmic that he decided next time he saw Shelley, he described it and asked Shelley, what was this? What did I experience? And Shelley was very nonchalant and he says, you woke up a few of the atoms in your little toe, that's all. And that's an intriguing idea because imagine if that's just a few atoms in your little toe and there's how many trillions of atoms in your body. What was Shelley implying in terms of if you were to awaken all the cells in your body? Which in a sense is kind of what these traditions are implying when they talk about transforming your body into the light body, into the fully immortal body, so to speak. I personally tend to lean towards the idea that the immortal body is not so much the physical, that it's more so a state of wakefulness that never ebbs or flows depending on sleep, depending on life or death, or the rebirth cycle, that it's always there. Either way is fine, it's important either way. But the point is, getting back to our original question about enlightenment, and what enlightenment is it just that partial view that sees it as just getting to the higher state through samadhi, or is it that holistic view that takes into account all the different levels? And I really do think it's that holistic approach because you do see an imbalance with some people when they get so heavily into going for the penthouse, the spiritual penthouse, that I've met yogis where how do I say this? I've met practitioners in the spiritual traditions who were very unhealthy. Now sometimes you can't help that and that's not a judgment, but where you see them with extremely bad habits, or not that I am a saint in that regard, but the point is that I think that there has to be that attention paid to not just the spiritual emphasis, but things like diet, for example, things like emotions, things like thoughts. I studied with a Zen master once, not Daido. Daido was a brilliant guy, but I studied with a Zen teacher once who, it was a great Zen session, and after the session was over, we went out and had tea in the anteroom of the Zen center. And this guy starts bad rapping other Zen teachers, and he's like gossiping, and again, we're all human, but I was really shocked that he was such a great teacher talking about enlightenment and Zen, and yet when he got off stage, so to speak, he had these very strange, I thought pretty toxic ideas. So you can work on one level and completely ignore the others. Now, any questions about any of this before we start wrapping up here, because I think we're getting close to the end. Okay, that whole notion of immortality, this is again a little tangential, but I think it's a curious idea. There's something in the esoteric literature and the oral teachings that I've heard referred to as transference of consciousness. Shelley used to talk about this, Kriyananda used to talk about this, namely that some sages have the ability supposedly have the ability, before they die in this physical body, to dole off part of their awareness into another body, into a young child somewhere, so that there's no rupturing of consciousness when they die. They can just shift over from this body that's decaying over into that other body and continue on without any, hemorrhaging of awareness, no loss of continuity. A friend of mine asked, Kriya Yoga claimed that was true of Shelley. No way to prove that one way or the other. But my friend Dave once asked Shelley, without asking him point blank, do you live in more than one body simultaneously? He said, what would be the purpose of someone doing that? And Shelley had a funny militaristic response. He said, reserves. I thought that was a clever way to approach it. Now, what I'm going to do here, just to close off, is this is a point that I've made online a number of times, and I think it's a good one. I often come back to this when I'm meditating. And in a very simple way to describe this, you see a galaxy like this. This is Andromeda, and there's roughly 200 billion stars in this galaxy. And imagine if you were lord of a galaxy, like in George Lucas's universe. You might have someone that's lord over an entire galaxy of 200 billion stars. And it's a science fiction idea, but in a very real way, that describes you and me in terms of just our physical body alone. And what I mean is that you have many, many more times atoms in your body and molecules and cells than there are stars in that galaxy. And somewhere in there is you, whatever you are. Somewhere in there is that awareness that oversees it all. And it is your own universe. It's much bigger than a galaxy is proportionally in terms of sheer atoms and molecules and cells. And when I sit in meditation, I often find it very useful to come to that sense of just that cosmic nature of your own body. And at any rate, I want to close with one technique that I think is not a bad way to kind of practice on amplifying that awareness of the spirit. And it's very simple. It's take a moment to think of something or someone that you've loved in your life. It can be a pet. I often find that's very easy for some people because it tends not to be too conditional on various things. It could be someone, it could be a grandmother you've had, it could be a child of yours. Think of someone or something that you feel a great deal of love, or that simply evokes beauty for you, that evokes a sense of kindness or warmth. And take a moment, if you would, to close your eyes and hold that in front of you, that idea of that person, that being, that creature, whatever it may be. And try to imagine that sense of caring, that sense of nurturing, that sense of love that is there between you two. And imagine that congealing into a ball, a golden ball of light. And that's maybe floating in front of you. All that energy between you is converging like a lens into a ball of light. And feel it radiating warmth, that sense of that love, that sense of that beauty. Slowly breathe in and breathe out, settle down the mind as you feel that energy. Now imagine that ball of light moving up into your head, into the middle of your head. And just imagine it there around the area of the pineal gland. Just resting there, glowing, sending out vibrations throughout your brain, through your head, into the pineal gland. And as you breathe in and out, just take 10-20 seconds to feel that sense. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to chant out Om. And you can either, if you're at home listening to this, chant along with it, or just sit silently and listen to my chant. But imagine that as I'm chanting it, that you're sending that energy out from your body, from your mind, from your brain, into the entire world around you with the vibration of all. All right. Before we wrap up here, I wanted to mention for those of you that are listening to this live, because a few of you listen to this after the fact, we have an extremely unusual set of energies in the stars the next few days. Some of them quite good, some not as good, but definitely pushing people towards change. A lot of activity churning up in the stars, 4 station points, but also tomorrow, Thursday and Friday, the 27th and 28th, I believe that is. We've got a Jupiter trining the Sun. It's actually a Jupiter trining Sun Neptune if you look at the last week or so. This is an exceptionally good time for meditating, for prayer, for kind of ritual of any sort of spiritual sort. But you may notice as well that there are a lot of changes in your life and other people's lives. They're probably not going to be all good or all bad, but just today alone I've talked to people that have said that some unusually important things have happened for them or for people around them. So pay very close attention, but I do want to emphasize, if you can, try to spend 5, 10, 15 minutes if possible doing some kind of meditation, some kind of interning the next few days because of that Jupiter trining the Sun in Pisces. It's like an opening, you might say, when there's more of, I think, a potential for that accessing of the higher levels. So I'll close on that note. If there's not any more questions, I'll leave a few seconds here if anyone wants to write something down. All righty, thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Namaste.